Thank you, Uma, for the introduction, and thank you, John, for the invitation. I'd like to also thank the Center for Gandhian Studies and the University, Central University of Kerala, for extending this kind invitation to me. So the subject of today's talk is Gandhi, African American intellectuals, and the matter of race. But let me, at the outset, say a few things by way of a preface. First, my remarks are not on the subject of Gandhi's years in South Africa. I think the middle term of the title of my talk should make it very clear. I'm really going to be adverting to African American intellectuals and activists and writers from 1920s until the assassination of Martin Luther King in the late 1960s. Secondly, this paper, my remarks today, was not precipitated by the recent attacks on statues of Gandhi in the United States and United Kingdom in the wake of what is called the BLM, or the Black Lives Matter movement. Some of you, I'm sure in India as well, all of you have some knowledge of what had happened there, but perhaps not in the detail in which some people might have it in the US, perhaps, but there have been a number of statues of Gandhi that have been vandalized. The statue, one statue in London, they had to pretty much put it in a cage, as it were, so that it wouldn't be attacked. And this has been the subject of some discussion, why that should have been the case. But this paper, or the set of remarks that I'm offering today, as I want to insist, is not precipitated that because I've been thinking about these matters long before any of this came to the surface. I first wrote about Gandhi and African American intellectuals and activists in 2009 in a very long article published in New Literary History in 2009 called Gandhi's West, the West's Gandhi. And as I've suggested, I've been thinking about these matters for some years. Thirdly, the fact that my remarks are not directed principally towards his years in South Africa or towards addressing the question, was Gandhi a racist? Because believe it or not, that question has become important for some people, right? The fact that my remarks are not directed principally towards that should not be construed as meaning that I consider such inquiries unimportant. Quite to the contrary, if there are serious critiques of Gandhi, they should be addressed. And I think that the question of where he stood on the question of race should be addressed. There's no question about that. I hope that at the end of today's presentation, you will see that there may be other ways of approaching the question, not just looking at his years in South Africa. Fourthly, what I am doing today can be viewed as a chapter in intellectual and cultural history, in what used to be called, to use an old-fashioned expression, what used to be called the history of ideas, which was actually a very particular way of thinking about certain problems and their genealogies and so on. And the history of ideas was, in fact, something that was a very firm kind of intellectual approach, which was rather common in the 1920s and 30s, but since then has declined. Of course, that doesn't mean that those people, that once that particular way of thinking about a set of problems, that once that way had sort of fallen into decline, it doesn't, of course, mean that people were not interested anymore in ideas or in intellectual histories. That's, of course, not even remotely the case. But this was a particular way of constructing a certain set of ideas and their intellectual genealogy, right? So this what I'm doing today is something of an exercise of that kind. I will, of course, be hinting at various points in my presentation today about some of the other implications of the kind of work that I'm putting forward before you, and more particularly about the possibilities and promises of understanding South-South exchanges. I think the meaning of that will become more clear when we move towards the end of my presentation. Lastly, by way of a preface, the theme I'm covering is not wholly uncharted. Uh, However, I do, of course, draw upon material that others who have preceded me have not addressed. And more significantly, I have my own particular readings of what is really an extraordinary chapter in global intellectual history. But I think it is important to acknowledge those who have preceded me in some of these inquiries. Among them, Sudarshan Kapoor, who 3 decades ago wrote a book called Raising Up a Prophet, where he actually even made fairly extensive use of the African American press. I mean, that book has somewhat unfortunately fallen into oblivion. Rather unfortunate, I say, because I mean, although I think his intellectual trajectory was narrow in certain ways, he essentially looked at a kind of a territory which hadn't really been covered before, and came to the realization that you cannot think of Martin Luther King as the beginning and the end of the African-American encounter with Mohandas Gandhi. That has been one of the real pitfalls of this whole particular inquiry into the connections between Black Americans and Gandhi, that more or less it really begins and stops with Martin Luther King. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that that's not at all the case, right? There is also the work more recently of Nico Slate, a book by him called Colored Cosmopolitanism. But again, you will see where I depart from some of that. And most recently, the work with which I think in India almost probably no one is familiar. I suspect only a couple of people may be familiar at best. The work of Sarah Azaransky, who has written on the relationship, the long relationship of Gandhi to Black theologians of the 1930s and 40s, and then Black activists as well. Now, moving on to my formal paper, you will, I think, all agree with me, as I've already suggested to you, and I want to simply reiterate it, that in the most common narrative that we have encountered in thousands of books, the name of Martin Luther King is effortlessly paired with that of Gandhi. Often the name of Nelson Mandela is added to Gandhi and King to form a kind of a triumvirate of the idea of nonviolent resistance. And this has become part of our global common sense to think of the three of them together. There are lots of reasons why we shouldn't also think of them together, but that's another subject, okay? And particularly Mandela, who in my view has a very complicated history in relationship to the idea of nonviolent resistance. Because I can remind you, for those of you who are familiar with some of the contours of the history of South Africa, that it was Nelson Mandela who created the armed wing of the African National Congress, the Umkhonto we Sizwe, and who himself repudiated the ANC, that is the African National Congress's adherence to the idea of nonviolence. Right, so the Mandela of the 60s and 70s is not the Mandela that we often think about when we place him alongside Gandhi and King, because what we are thinking of is that extraordinarily gracious man who, when he was released from Robben Island after serving 30 years, okay, in that jail, was a person who was willing to forgive his enemies and opponents, and who then created what is called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think we can learn something from that in India, if I may say so. If they had something even remotely resembling the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the atrocities of Gujarat in 2002, we might be a different country than we are today. But that's another story. That's a very long story. All right. Now, in my narrative, what I will be doing is I will be focusing on 5 things. Each of these I could elaborate upon at enormous length, all right, because I simply want to convey to you the parameters of this encounter between African-American intellectuals, writers, and activists with Gandhi. All right. And in some cases, it was an encounter which was face to face. In some cases, it was only an encounter of ideas. Right. So the five things I want to focus on is the long relationship of W.E.B. Du Bois to Mohandas Gandhi, number one. Number two, the interest in what used to be called the Negro Gandhi. That is the idea of raising a Negro Gandhi. The word Negro itself is no longer used. Of course, it's not as pejorative as the other N word, but it's still pejorative, but it is used. And Martin Luther King himself used it all the time when he was speaking about the problems of the 50s and 60s and referring to Black people. And in connection with that, I'll be looking at Black theologians very briefly and their interactions with Gandhi. Thirdly, I want to look at one Black writer, just one, as an illustration of how in the African-American artistic world and the literary world, they thought of Gandhi. And the figure I shall be looking at is the extraordinarily gifted poet, Langston Hughes. And I shall look at two poems of his, which speak of Gandhi. Fourthly, I'm interested in the long-standing interest in Gandhi in the African-American press. Okay? And when I speak of the African-American press, what I'm really referring to is newspapers that were Black newspapers, that is, that they were under Black ownership, under African-American ownership. And I will describe to you very briefly some of these papers, and some of these newspapers had a rather massive circulation. And I have found in my search over the course of the last 3-4 years, I've had a research assistant who's really helped me out. I have found about 2,000 articles in 6 or 7 newspapers, which are solely devoted to the Indian independence movement and largely to Gandhi. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary, the extent of Black interest in Mohandas Gandhi, right? And fifthly, I shall look just passingly at the activists of the civil rights movement who actually taught Martin Luther King what he knew about Gandhi. Because I think we have to appreciate the fact that Martin Luther King knew absolutely nothing about Gandhi when he first started thinking about the idea of nonviolent resistance. He came, as many others did, in the civil rights movement. And when I speak of many others, I'm speaking principally of the leadership here, because at least half the leadership, if not more of, at least half the leadership were men of the church. These were people who had been ordained as ministers. They were, so you know, Martin Luther King himself is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. You have the Reverend James Lawson, Reverend James Shuttleworth, and there were a number of churches they were associated with. The AME Church, for example, the Methodist Episcopal Church, some of them were associated with the Baptist Church, but there were only a limited number of churches they were associated with. And all of these people had a much greater familiarity with Gandhi than did Martin Luther King in the beginning. All right, so then it was going to be some years before Martin Luther King was going to acquire a certain substantial knowledge of what Gandhi stood for and what some of his ideas were. So moving on to the first of these, W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois can, I think, be justly called the most famous African-American intellectual of the 20th century. I mean, he, for a while, he reigned over the scene. He had a very long and rich and productive life. He was also someone who had very sharp and critical views of the United States. And towards the end of his life, he repudiated his American citizenship and moved to Ghana, where he died in exile in Ghana. He was also a lifelong member of the Communist Party. Now that's something that we need to think about, because we need to understand how a lifelong communist like him became, if you will pardon the use of my expression, became addicted to Gandhi. And he did. in the course of his lifetime, he wrote 18 fairly lengthy pieces on Gandhi. And what is interesting is that they don't come from one small period. We're talking about a period of 50 years. When, if you look at the first essay and the last essay, it's nearly a period of 45, 50 years that divides the two essays. And he maintained this interest, which extends beyond Indian independence and extends beyond Gandhi's assassination on January 30th, 1948. The last essay that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote on Gandhi is in the late 50s, just shortly before his death. And you can see that he maintains this unflinching and steady interest in Gandhi that he'd had right at the outset. And I say this also because in India, a lot, and by left scholars outside India as well, who have looked at India, a lot has been made of the supposed connections between W.E.B. Du Bois and Dr. Ambedkar, B.R. Ambedkar. But that relationship is really peripheral if you look at the lifelong interest that W.E.B. Du Bois had in Gandhi, which thus far really has not been investigated by anyone at any great length. I mean, Nico Slade talks about it a little bit, but that's more or less pretty much it. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois became most well known, of course, in the United States for his 1903 collection of essays, The Souls of Black Folk, where he wrote the cliched line that everyone has heard, and notwithstanding the fact that it's cliched, all the events of the last few months have shown that the problem that he identified is the problem that persists today. And that line is, he said that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, right? So this is from The Souls of Black Folk. And a few years after this, he gets an opportunity to put his stamp on the idea of the color line when he assumes the role of founding editor of the journal, The Crisis. Now, this is quite an extraordinary journal. Its subtitle is, quote, a record of the darker races, all right? And this journal is the organ of the NAACP. The NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, right? But even though it's the organ of the NAACP, Du Bois immediately turned it into a vehicle for his own staunchly held views. I think the comparable situation would be something like the Indian Opinion, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, which, of course, as some of you are aware, is a journal that Gandhi founded when he was living in South Africa. And he was not its editor for most of the lifetime of this particular journal. There's a mistaken conception that Gandhi was the editor throughout. No, he wasn't. He actually turned it over to him, but it's safe to say that no article published in Indian Opinion was published without Gandhi's knowledge and approval, right? And so something similar of that kind is happening in The Crisis, where Du Bois is the editor for some years, but then even there are years when he's not the editor. So it was basically a journal that, in some sense, you could say he really owned in a particular way. Now, what is remarkable about Du Bois is that even though he is the preeminent spokesperson for colored people, Black people, okay, in the United States, that from the outset, he seems to have an eye towards the entire colonized world. And that is how he gave shape to the journal, which is why that subtitle, A Record of the Darker Races, I think is quite important. So, you know, if you look at pages of The Crisis, you see that the coverage includes India, Africa, other parts of Asia, large parts of the colonized world, all right? In order to understand the texture of this journal and why this is important, in order to understand that, we can turn profitably to a book that was written a few years ago by Isabel Hofmeyr, a South African scholar. This is a book which is on Gandhi's experiments in slow reading, as she calls it, right? Indian Opinion commenced publication on 6 June 1903, and Hofmeyr says that it is one of the great intellectual archives of the world. Produced in a context of multiple diasporic intersections in Southern Africa, the paper's pages are woven from a variety of global intellectual filaments drawn from the larger trajectories of migration. Though Indian Opinion has been mined for Gandhi's views during his years in South Africa, Hofmeyr calls attention to certain features of its production, circulation, dissemination, and worldview in an attempt to understand how Gandhi grappled with print modernity. The newspaper itself appeared in 4 languages: English, Tamil, Gujarati, and Hindi. But this is to be taken as an instantiation not only of Gandhi's awareness of the different constituencies to which he was responsible or whose allegiance he sought, okay, but also to his commitment to a more ecumenical conception of justice. The newspaper, in its various editions, also evokes a complex configuration of the world, knitting together narratives of Indian indenture in various locales, the world of Gujarati merchants scattered as they had been for centuries across numerous sites of exchange encompassed by the Indian Ocean, the sacred geographies of multiple faiths, the politics of European metropoles, and much else. Right? So, this idea that Paul Gilroy raised 2-3 decades ago about a Black Atlantic and Black internationalism, this was incipient in the pages of Indian Opinion and The Crisis, both these journals. I mean, that's the astonishing thing, that, if you look at the pages of the Indian Opinion, you see that there is a different kind of internationalism that it's really already really positive. And all of this is being done long before it became fashionable, of course, to speak about the idea of the global South. I mean, the phrase didn't even exist at that time, right? But what I'm suggesting to you that it's already incipient and the very first project that Gandhi actually undertakes in some ways, right? And this idea is what enables us to link the struggles of African Americans to the histories of Black people in Africa, the Caribbean, and the African diaspora, the fate of colored peoples in Asia and Africa, living under different regimes of colonial domination, and politics and dissent in European imperial capitals. Now, DuBois wrote a great many, indeed most of the editorials for The Crisis. Again, it's a little bit like Indian Opinion, and even that later journal coming out from Ahmedabad called Young India, which then later transmuted into Harijan, because there were very few issues of any of these 3 journals where Gandhi did not have an opinion piece. There were some issues where he didn't, but in most issues he did. And I can tell you, I'm sure that in some casual sense you're aware of it, but I'd like you to think about it, that if Gandhi had done nothing else in his whole life, right, he would probably be remembered as one of the great figures in the history of Indian journalism because of the way in which he ran these newspapers, managed them, edited them, supervised them, and the worldview that was put forward in these particular journals. All right. So when I say that DuBois wrote these op-ed pieces, it's also important to understand what kind of writings we're really speaking about here. So as an illustration of the kind of ecumenism that you find in The Crisis, in 1914, The Crisis offered news of a strike instigated by Gandhi among East Indian workmen in Natal, South Africa, prompted by the mistreatment of Indian workers and the arrest of another 2,000 workers who had with deliberation violated the law that prevented Indians from transgressing the border between Transvaal and Natal. In a related vein, stitching together news of the burgeoning Indian diaspora, The Crisis gave news of the arrest of 24 Calcutta Hindus arriving in Vancouver, whose journey had originated in Hong Kong rather than India, and who therefore were subject to deportation, since ingress into Canada was only permitted to those who had made a continuous journey from the land of their birth. Right? So you can see that what The Crisis is doing is that it is now stitching together a whole narrative of the Indian diaspora, of the working class there, right, in places such as British Columbia, South Africa, and so on. Finally, DuBois is going to turn to India itself, right? He's going to turn to India itself. This is going to be really fundamentally after the end of World War I. And one of the things that really astonished me when I began to look at the pages of the crisis was to discover that the crisis covered the Hunter Commission report in substantial detail. Now, let me explain to all of you what the Hunter Commission report is. I mean, there may be some historians of colonial India who might remember the Hunter Commission report. So in 1919, you had a set of events that are encompassed under the rubric of the Punjab disturbances. And of course, the most notorious part of the Punjab disturbances was the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, right, which we all know of, on April 13th, on Vaisakhi Day, 1919. Now, following the massacre and the Punjab disturbances, some weeks after that, given the uproar and outrage that it had caused, and again, you should all recall that it is the Punjab disturbances that in some ways put Gandhi onto the national scene, right? Because Gandhi had arrived in India in 1915, in early January 1915, after having spent over 20 years in South Africa. And when he came to India, he was not exactly a household name. He was not completely unknown. I wouldn't say that he was an unknown entity, but India was not a vacuum. I mean, there were already a substantial number of major political leaders with large followings. I'm talking about people like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, I'm talking about Bipin Chandra Pal, right? And many others. Right? So when Gandhi comes back to India, he has to obviously make an attempt to acquaint himself with the country. And it is really only in 1919, after he had inserted himself into some local struggles, if we could put it that way, in Ahmedabad, of course, in Champaran, right? It is after that he is going to be able to get onto the national scene. And once the Punjab disturbances, the Jallianwala Bagh, the incident of the crawling lane, all of these atrocities had taken place, the British decided that they were going to appoint a commission of inquiry into these events. And that commission of inquiry is called the Hunter Commission. The Congress realized that this was a major form of governmentality, the commission of inquiry report, right? And that this would be, if I may cut to the chase and use a colloquialism, that this would be a whitewashing. So what did the Congress do? It had appointed its own committee. I mean, this is one of the more interesting aspects of the intellectual history of Indian nationalism, is the particular way in which it appropriates various kinds of forms of governmentality that the British had, and then the Congress takes these as its own and does something else with it. And to cut a long story short here, what the Congress is going to do is it's going to appoint its own committee to look into the Punjab disturbances. And the person who is going to write the report of that committee is Gandhi. That report is included in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. All right? It's quite an extraordinary chapter in itself, the whole writing of this report and all of that. Now, what is even more interesting is that W.E.B. DuBois, editing this journal in the United States, where thus far we cannot say that any African American had any experience of India whatsoever, right? The W.E.B. DuBois devotes several pages to a dissection of the official report, right? And it's in that context eventually that Gandhi's name is going to come up. I mean, at that point, he doesn't highlight the role of Gandhi. In fact, I'm not sure that he was aware that the Congress had appointed its own committee, because what he's doing is he's dissecting, he's taking apart the official report, the official Hunter Commission report, right? So Gandhi has thus far had a shadowy presence. His name has not appeared in the pages of the crisis, but finally in May 1921, DuBois, for the first time, takes explicit notice of Gandhi, identifying him as the editor of the journal Young India, and identifying him as someone who had been a staunch loyalist to the British Empire, but was now veering towards becoming a non-cooperator. Remember the speech that Gandhi gave in his own defense at his trial in 1922, where he charted his journey from being a loyalist, someone who believed that Indians could acquire their rights within the British Empire, to someone who became an advocate of non-cooperation and non-violent resistance to colonial rule, right? Someone who deplored, as DuBois says, the treachery of the British and proposed to resist colonial rule with a demonstration of the bravery of the soul, right? Now, 2 months later, so this is May 1921, 2 months later, the reader of the crisis would become witness to the apotheosis of Gandhi, right? Who is going to be lionized in an unsigned editorial, which we know was written by DuBois. That editorial is called India's Saint, right? This is in July 1921, all right? And the article, I don't have the time right now to go over the content of the editorial in detail, because the whole tone of it is really quite marvelous. You know, the nuance with which he writes, the sense of irony. He says of Gandhi, well, you know, what we've heard about him is he eats only vegetables, he only eats rice and nuts. By voluntary fasting, he has turned himself into a skeleton, etc., etc. Right? He dresses like a poor working man, he walks barefoot, so forth and so on. This is obviously the idea of Gandhi that had now begun to circulate in the West, right? But he essentially, the claim that he makes is a moral claim. The moral claim is that Gandhi, that for the first time, we are now face to face, he says. This is DuBois speaking. For the first time, we are face to face with a blameless life. Those are his words, right? Blameless life, right? March 1922 issue is dedicated to Gandhi and India, all right? And there he charts the whole ascendancy of Gandhi to supremacy in Indian politics, and suggests that what Gandhi is doing is something that is of distinctive importance, he says, to American Negroes. He says, behold a man who has ancient and great India at his feet, and whom a powerful government is afraid to arrest, characterizing Gandhi as a man who professes to love his enemies and who refuses to take advantage of or embarrass government in a crisis, right? Right, and he continues on in this vein. But what is, I think, the most interesting episode in this relationship between Gandhi and DuBois, as I'm describing, a relationship which is conducted only, as I said, through the pages of the crisis, and Gandhi, incidentally, of course, took note of DuBois every now and then, not that often, but particularly because, of course, DuBois and African Americans were interested in the possibilities of deploying the idea of nonviolent resistance in India itself, right? So the most interesting episode of this, and I want to read this out, and I will conclude my discussion of DuBois with that, because I want to move on to other elements of the story, is that in 1929, in February 1929, DuBois meets Sarojini Naidu and Charlie Andrews. I'm sure that most of you, but perhaps not all of you, are aware that Charlie Andrews was a very close friend of Gandhi, and actually Andrews Ganj in Delhi is named after him. You all know who Sarojini Naidu is, of course. That Sarojini Naidu and Charlie Andrews had come to the United States on a trip where they were representing the Congress Party. So he introduces himself as the editor of a magazine. So after having met them, he feels emboldened to write to Gandhi personally. And thus far, he has not written to Gandhi. Remember that he's published editorials in his newspaper, which are about Gandhi and the freedom struggle in India. But thus far, he has not conducted a personal correspondence. So he says, so he writes to him in 1929, introduces himself as the editor of a magazine with a subscription of 30,000 educated American Negroes. And DuBois says, wonders if Gandhi would consider sending a message to those 12 million people who are the grandchildren of slaves and who, amid great difficulties, are forging forward in America. Right? That's the request that he has. Now, before I share with you Gandhi's response, we have to ask ourselves, why should DuBois have thought that Gandhi, in particular, had a message that Black Americans would be eager to hear? And the last line, of his letter offers a clue, although not truly an explanation. While aware that Gandhi had many demands upon his time, he reminds him that the race and color problems are worldwide, and we need your help here. All right, this is the claim that DuBois is making. Now, Gandhi chose to respond with what he called a little love message for African Americans. And I'm going to repeat this twice because these are among the three most extraordinary lines in Gandhi's voluminous writings. And these lines, of course, are the kind of lines that are easily subject to misreadings, to certain kinds of deliberate readings, which really are not supported by the sentiment which obviously informs his answer. What does he say? He says, quote, "Let not the 12 million Negroes be ashamed of the fact that they are the grandchildren of slaves. There is no dishonor in being slaves. There is dishonor in being slave owners. Right? There is no dishonor in being slaves. There is dishonor in being slave owners." And of course, DuBois understood fully what Gandhi was saying, because what, of course, Gandhi is saying, to put it in the simplest Hegelian terms, right, is that the ontology of the slave is always superior to the ontology of the slave owner, because the slave will always recognize the slave owner as a human being, as a man. But the ontology of the slave owner does not permit recognition of the slave as someone who is fully human. And what did DuBois do? He displays Gandhi's missive, his reply, on the front cover of the July issue of the Crisis, accompanying it with a biographical note on Gandhi where he declares him, quote, "the greatest colored man in the world, and perhaps the greatest man in the world," speculating further that real human equality and brotherhood in the United States will come only under the leadership of another Gandhi. And then a year later, he's going to go on to describe Gandhi as akin to the Buddha, Muhammad, Jesus Christ, right? We saw all of these representations, by the way, at the time of Gandhi's death. You know, I've been working with prints, what are called nationalist prints, which came out in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And of course, immediately following Gandhi's assassination or his shahidat on January 30th, there was a large number of printmakers who brought out various prints, and many of them show Gandhi with Christ and the Buddha, right? And what is interesting, again, here is that DuBois was also fully aware of the fact that there were some people who were a little bit skeptical in the United States about Gandhi. Particularly those who thought that Gandhi's methods could not work in the United States because Gandhi's methods were too deeply rooted in the ethos of India, in the culture and religious practices of the faiths that you had in India. So, for example, a number of commentators who said that, well, you know, Gandhi believes in asceticism and this kind of non-violence resistance that Gandhi has pushed forward is something for which really there is no precedence in the history of the West, that we don't really have any experience with that. And I will only add a little footnote here to the effect that I think that when they said that they didn't know the history of nonviolent resistance in the West either. But the important thing here is, I want to end with this little episode here, that DuBois says that, well, I'm aware of all of these people who are a little bit skeptical about Gandhi, and he says, so he concludes one of his articles with this scathing advisory for his countrymen. Quote, all America sees in Gandhi is a joke, but the real joke is America, end quote. Right? So that's W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, as I've suggested, to move to the second, I said I would look broadly at 5 aspects of the story here of African Americans and the history of their engagement with Gandhi and Gandhi's ideas, and the whole history of what we might describe as the nonviolent movement in India, which is how they saw it. All right. So if someone here in the audience told me, among the listeners told me that, well, this was a very partial view that they had of the Indian independence movement, because of course there was a Hindustan Republican Socialist Army, there was Bhagat Singh, and then there was Subhash Bose and all of that. That's true, but that's besides the point. The point is that they saw Gandhi as someone who, in a sense, represented what was happening in India. And I can assure you, all of you, that you don't find anything like this coverage on Subhash Bose or Bhagat Singh or any of the figures of the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, all right, or the armed revolutionary movement, as it was called. You don't find any coverage of this in the African American press at all. Right? It was really Gandhi and what they viewed as the nonviolent movement, which absolutely dominated their imagination. So, secondly, as I've already suggested, there was this idea that we need a Negro Gandhi in the United States. In the same way in which, for the last 4 decades, every now and then you will read an article coming out from Palestine saying, where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Right? So that's a way to understand what I mean when I said that there was this constant discussion in the United States, particularly among African Americans, where is the Negro Gandhi? Who will be the Negro Gandhi? And it is in this context that we find that Black theologians stepped in, because one supposition was that we should view Gandhi actually as the Black Christ. Right? So we're looking for a Black Gandhi in the United States, but Gandhi himself should be viewed as the Black Christ. So there was a tendency to view him, of course, within a Christian framework, to see him, excuse me, as a Christ-like figure. And again, there are different aspects of this particular narrative, but part of the narrative had to do with highlighting, obviously, certain aspects of the story of Christ, and in particular, this meant highlighting, obviously, certain aspects of the Gospel of Matthew, and most eminently of the Sermon on the Mount. Although there are, of course, other portions, even in the Corinthians, I would say scattered expressions throughout the New Testament, not in the Old Testament, but throughout the New Testament, which would point to this idea that Christ was in his own way an advocate of nonviolence. Now, I am not going to pass a judgment on that particular point of view. This is not something I want to weigh in on this matter, because there is a very considerable literature which has to do with the relation with Christianity and nonviolence. But what I do want to say is that this is the context in which this idea of the Black Christ really arose. Okay, so if you look at the writings of the 20s and 30s, you find a huge number of writers in the United States who are pointing to their admiration for Gandhi and placing him within a Christian framework. They were also well aware of the fact that Gandhi had interacted with missionaries extensively, particularly in South Africa where there is a long record of his what you might disguise as is a long record of Christian missionaries being part of the circle of interlocutors that he had in various ways, and that there were discussions about the place of nonviolent resistance in Christianity that he certainly had with these interlocutors back in South Africa. It is very interesting to note in this context that nearly every Christian missionary who met Gandhi and who thought that he might be able to convert Gandhi came away with the opinion that it was absolutely futile to think of converting Gandhi. Why? Because Gandhi was a much better Christian than any Christian that they had ever known, right? That was one reason why Christian missionaries abandoned this idea that, well, we need to try to convert someone like Gandhi, right? But this is the context in which I'm suggesting to you Gandhi is being received. Okay, so once you put him into the Christian framework, then obviously what it meant was that when there was a call for a Negro Gandhi, it meant if effectively we want a person who, right, we want effectively a person who speaks in the language of Christ to us. All right, that is I'm suggesting to you fundamentally one reason why these Black theologians became very interested in Gandhi. Now, the other aspect of this story is a concerted attempt by Black theologians to get to know Gandhi in person. So there are a number of delegations that are going to go there. And when I'm speaking of Black theologians, let me just roll out a few names. You can Google them later on and look them up. And but there's a fairly substantial body of work that has been done in the last 15, 20 years in particular on these Black theologians and their interactions with Gandhi. In some cases, as I said, personal interactions with Gandhi and their writings on Gandhi. So I'm referring to Mordecai Johnson, Howard Thurman, Benjamin Mays, right? These are among the three major figures. There are several others as well. And Howard Thurman is going to actually come to India. So he takes a long trip through India, which will also take him to Sri Lanka. And in 1936, he finally meets up with Gandhi. The purpose of that trip actually was to really meet Gandhi, but then because he hadn't been to India before, he's accompanied by his wife and he's accompanied by another couple, and both Howard Thurman and the man there who accompanies him, they're both ministers of the church. So these are theologians who are ministers as well. They're not just professors of theology, although Thurman was. Most of these people I'm speaking about were professors of theology, and some of them headed Black universities as well. So Howard Thurman is going to visit him, and the record of their conversation is available in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. But there is another source for that as well. I say that deliberately because sometimes, not with reference to this particular conversation, sometimes people have argued that Gandhi tried to cover up his tracks, that you can't believe what he says always. So, for example, that in Satyagraha in South Africa, the argument is that Gandhi actually, Joseph Lelewel made that argument in his biography, that Gandhi actually tried to cover up some of his tracks, tried to disguise some of the views that he had early on, because when he wrote Satyagraha in South Africa, it was an opportunity for him to fashion to his own image for others, right? In this particular case, in the case of Howard Thurman, this conversation is available not only in the collected works, it's available in Thurman's own autobiography. Right? He has spoken about his trip to India and his encounter with Gandhi at enormous length. All right. And what is it that Gandhi says to Thurman? I mean, this is really quite significant, right? What he says to him at the end of this conversation is, he says, I dare say that the next phase, the next great phase of this struggle of non-violent resistance in the world will be carried out by your people. By your people. Right? That's 19 1936. All right. So that's the second chapter in the of the 5 chapters that I'm broadly looking at. Thirdly, this one will be short because I want to allow enough time for discussion, and I still have 2 more after this. Thirdly, I want to look very briefly at one poet to give you an idea of what were the views about Gandhi that were entertained by leading African American writers. And Langston Hughes is as good a figure as any, because for those of you who do comparative literature or have any interest in African American literature, you know that he has a gigantic place in what is called the Harlem Renaissance. And Langston Hughes was one of the fundamental, one of the most important voices to come out of that milieu, which in my judgment, I mean, I will say very broadly for you, just as my in my own view, that I think the richest and most creative period in the history of the United States is the Black or African American resistance, literature, music that came out from the mid 1920s until the late 1960s. That 40 years is an astonishingly rich period in every respect. And I would say the richest period of creativity in the history of the United States. Now, Langston Hughes was, like W.E.B. DuBois, a confirmed communist, certainly for a time. I think that some of his political views really changed later on. All right. And in 1932, he writes a poem called Goodbye, Christ. Goodbye, Christ. That's what the poem is called. I'll just read it out. Goodbye, Christ, Jesus, Lord, God, Jehovah. Beat it on away from here now. Make way for a new guy with no religion at all. A real guy named Marx, communist, Lenin, peasant, Stalin, worker. Me, I said me. Go ahead on now. You're getting in the way of things, Lord. And please take Saint Gandhi with you when you go. Right? So bid him farewell. This was Langston Hughes in this poem called Goodbye, Christ, written in 1932 during a trip that he took to the Soviet Union. It appeared in the pages of the Negro Worker, the Berlin-based journal of the Communist Third International, before making its way into the Baltimore Afro-American. Right? So the Baltimore Afro-American is one of these Black-owned newspapers that I was referring to, where its publication aroused considerable controversy within and without the African community for years to come. Right? So then you might be thinking to yourself, but that's a rather derogatory view that he has of Gandhi. So what am I trying to illustrate? In order to understand that, we have to turn to a poem that he writes on Gandhi in 1943. And it is remarkable, the shift in perspective. This is the poem. Mighty Britain tremble, let your empire's standard sway, let it break entirely. My Gandhi fasts today. My Gandhi fasts today, because this was, between 1933 and his last fast, which was only conducted just a couple of weeks before he was assassinated, Gandhi undertook a number of fasts. Some were in the cause of, Hindu-Muslim unity, some were on behalf of the Dalits or Harijans, as he called them. There were a number of other occasions as well. There was a famous fast in 1939. But Gandhi was the master of the fast. And when he went on a long fast, it was worldwide news. Right? So the poem is called Gandhi is Fasting. Gandhi is fasting. Let me repeat it again, the first verse, and then I'll go to the next. Mighty Britain tremble, let your empire standard sway, let it break entirely. My Gandhi fast today. It's very interesting. The possessive, all right, ness, as it were. My Gandhi fast today. Right? You may think it foolish that there's no truth in what I say, that all of Asia is watching as Gandhi fasts today. All of Asia is watching, and I am watching too, for I am also Jim Crowed as India is Jim Crowed by you. You know quite well, Great Britain, that it is not right to starve and beat and oppress those who are not white. Of course, we do it too here in the USA. May Gandhi's prayers help us as well as he fasts today. Right? Now, I think we can begin to see why is it that Langston Hughes changed his worldview his perspective so radically from 1930 to 1943. I mean, that's a subject for investigation, which I don't have the luxury of sharing with you right now. But I'll just very briefly mention a couple of things for you to ponder over. One, of course, was by 1943, he knew, Langston Hughes knew what was happening in the Soviet Union. He knew the purges. He knew the kind of extraordinarily brutal system of domination that had come into place in the Soviet Union. He also saw what was happening in the world around him at that time. I mean, he saw entire societies crumbling. 1943, by this point in time, much of Europe is destroyed. Right? Tens of millions of people have already been killed. I think he's coming to an awareness of the absolute futility, not simply of violence, but he is coming to an awareness of the futility of so-called ideas of revolution which sacrifice the human being. Right? And he came to understand that this is exactly what Gandhi was not doing, that Gandhi stood for a much higher conception of the human being. Right? And this is one of the fundamental reasons why this poem in 1943 reflects a very different perspective than the one that you see in 1932. Then there is the matter of the African American press. Now, I think, John, I'll just go on for another 5 minutes because I want to make sure that we leave at least 20 minutes for discussion. All right.
And yes, so, go ahead.
Sorry?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So this will be very brief because I want to leave you with some intellectual conclusions. I don't want to leave you only with a narrative, right? But what I was going to say about the African American press is that what we're really speaking about are a large number of newspapers such as the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Crisis, the Messenger, the Norfolk, this is a Virginia Recorder, and several others. I don't recall all the names right now. There are about 7 or 8 that I've looked at in some detail. And these newspapers are newspapers with very substantial subscription base, very substantial. The Chicago Defender had a subscription of 250,000 at its peak. Now, remember that this is a newspaper which is for the African American constituency, right? Which means it's Black owned. Most of the staff working there is Black. The editors are Black. So 250,000 people subscribing to one single newspaper is a very large number of newspapers. And the Courier was large enough that it actually had correspondence in several parts of the country. One of these newspapers, which is a Pittsburgh Courier, even had a correspondent in India for a while, okay? A Black newspaper which even had a correspondent in India. These newspapers had circulation in Europe, Cuba, Canada, the British Caribbean, the Philippines. 2 years ago, I gave a lecture in Kerala where Professor C.S. Biju had invited me, which was entirely on the African American press. So I could share with you enormous amount of details about what was written in these newspapers and so on. But I think what is most striking is that the coverage is very, very favorable to Gandhi and to the Indian independence movement. All right, these newspapers were also very interesting for a number of reasons. For example, you find that many of them are attentive to the fact that what is distinctive about the nonviolent movement in India is the large number of women who took part in it as well, right? Because fundamentally the argument was that a nonviolent movement is more receptive to women. It is more hospitable to women, if I may put it this way, right? So, and some of the newspapers hint at what we might describe as a kind of a quasi-feminist reading, where they suggest that Gandhi himself actually used nonviolence because in some ways he was trying to feminize the public sphere. They don't exactly make that argument. This is my expression, but I'm suggesting that this argument is actually incipient in some of the pieces that you will see. It is also significant and important to mention that some of the newspapers do have criticisms of Gandhi. All right, we shouldn't assume that they all speak in a monolithic voice. There is a critical perspective, and one of the critical perspectives arose from the consideration that Gandhi was engaging in a language which was quasi-mystical. So some of the commentators worried about that. They thought that the kinds of conditions that you find in India are conditions which you really cannot find elsewhere in the world, that Gandhi really, in that sense, has nothing to teach the United States. Some of them were worried about the race question. All right, they were worried about the race question. They say that if you look at the record of Indians in East Africa, it is not very good. That's what their claim is, right? It is not very good, and that there is a history of some degree of racial animosity between Indians and Africans in East Africa. And some of these African American newspapers then point out that in their judgment, Gandhi and Nehru and the Congress have not done enough to critique the Indians living in East Africa. All right. So I want to make it quite certain that you understand that these newspapers are not speaking necessarily in a monolithic voice, but nonetheless, as I've suggested to you, what is really remarkable is not simply the extent of the coverage, but the worldview of Gandhi and the Congress, which they have made their own. That's, I think, the most important takeaway from looking at this African American press. So I'm going to omit the fifth part of this narrative now. And what I'm omitting the fifth part of this narrative, which has to do with the activists, and I might be able to take it up under, during the Q&A if there's anyone who has a question of that kind. And that has to do with the role of people like Bayard Rustin, James Farmer, James Lawson, Charles Shuttleworth, A. Philip Randolph, and many of the other people who were the preeminent leaders of the civil rights movement alongside Martin Luther King, most of whom, I have no hesitation in saying, were much better informed about Gandhi than was King, at least in the early years of King's activism. I think it took several years before King really was brought to an awareness of this literature that I'm really referring to. And to give you a sense of that before I move to my conclusion, let me quote to you something written in 1942 by a person that very few people in India have heard about. Even in the United States, he's an entirely forgotten figure, except among those who are historians of the civil rights movement. A gigantic figure in every possible way that you can think of. One of the founders of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, right? And one of the principal architects of the civil rights movement. I'm talking about James Farmer. And this is what he writes in 1942. How old was Martin Luther King in 1942? 12 to 13 years old at that time. And this is what James Farmer says. Quote, segregation will go on as long as we permit it to. Words are not enough. There must be action. We must withhold our support and participation from the institution of segregation in every area of American life. Not an individual witness to purity of conscience, as Thoreau used it, but a coordinated movement of mass non-cooperation as with Gandhi. And civil disobedience when laws are involved, and jail when necessary. More than the elegant cadre of generals we now have, we must also have an army of ground troops, like Gandhi's army, it must be non-violent. Guns would be suicidal for us. Yes, Gandhi has the key for me to unlock the door to the American dream. Gandhi has the key for me to unlock the door to the American dream. End quote. 1942. Rev. James Farmer. That's who is saying this. Right? And these people did a systematic study of the ideas of Gandhi and how they did it and what books they read, how they got trained is a very, very long history. All right. So, what do we make of all of this? What insights can we derive? The first fundamental insight is really this, okay? That we have to understand how a group of African American intellectuals writing at a time when knowledge of India was extremely poor, extremely poor. India was not taught and was not on the syllabus in school history textbooks in the United States. There was a few universities here and there where you could do something called Indian studies. It wasn't, of course, formally Indian studies. It was Sanskrit at that time, fundamentally, Indology, right? And the whole idea of doing Indian studies or South Asian studies is post-World War II, right? It has its own specific history. And among African Americans in particular, what knowledge would you typically have of India? Almost none. Conversely, what knowledge was there of African Americans in India? None whatsoever. Whatever we knew was what had come down from the hands of the British. And of course, from the British point of view, we weren't civilized enough. And of course, from their point of view, the African people were even less civilized. So you can imagine what kind of view that they might have held of African Americans. Right? The question here is, how is it that these African American intellectuals get so extraordinarily interested in what is happening in India? What were the intellectual processes through which this knowledge was mediated? Usually it's mediated through something. So you might say, okay, in this case, it was mediated by the teachings of Christianity. And what I have myself suggested to you about the idea of Gandhi as a black Christ, as it were, might tend to that view. But actually, I would say no, it wasn't. Because we have to remember that the Christianity of African Americans was radically different and is radically different from the Christianity of what were then the dominant churches. Right? I mean, the church, the African American church is a different institution, a very different institution. And it came to occupy a very different place in their lives because there was nothing else they could turn to, nothing else, during the long period of slavery. And Gandhi himself was reasonably well read in portions of the New Testament. The Old Testament, he said, put him to sleep, right? But it's not the case that Gandhi was any kind of scholar of Christianity as such, of course. So it would be really hard to make the case that it was just mediated through some common foundation of Christianity. And then some people might say, well, maybe it was mediated through, for example, the writings of Thoreau. Now, the problem there is that Thoreau was never envisioning the idea of mass nonviolent resistance. For him, it was a matter of conscience. And here we have a particular problem in the history of ideas because for Thoreau, the conscience is sovereign over parliament, so to speak. Okay? That is, that it's sovereign over laws, as it was for Gandhi in many ways, right? But Thoreau never moved from the individual to a collectivity. The problem for African Americans were, how do we create a mass base of resistance? All right? So we can't say that this was mediated through the writings of someone like Henry David Thoreau, who Gandhi, of course, had read as well. And there again, there's another whole chapter there, a whole intellectual history there, because the idea that Gandhi derived his ideas from Thoreau is an idea that he himself actually rejected, although it is still part of the scholarship. But there's a complicated history, of Gandhi and what he read of Thoreau and when he read it. And there's no question that the spirit of Thoreau moved him. There's no question about that whatsoever. All right. So the first interesting question we have here is that 10,000 miles apart, African Americans and Indians, one could argue, made common cause. All the more remarkable in view of the fact that they knew almost nothing about each other. Right? And secondly, following from this, we have to think about the possibilities of South-South exchanges, histories. Because I think one of the most unfortunate things that happened in India, and I think it happened in large parts of the colonized world, and that is that when we encountered the West and the West colonized us, our awareness of the rest of the world disappeared. We have to remember that we had much longer links with West Asia, with East Africa, okay, with the entire Indian Ocean world in India. We had links with this part of the world for centuries before we got to know the West. And the problem of intellectual history is that when people from the global South interact with each other, it's always mediated by the West. What do I have in common with a Nigerian intellectual or writer and one from Sudan and one from Malaysia, okay, and one from Argentina or Brazil? What do I have in common? What I have in common is we've all read Marx, we've all read Shakespeare, we've all read Hegel, we've all read Kant. But the Chinese and the Africans and the West Asians have not read the Indians, and the Indians have not read the West Asians and the Afghans and the Chinese, right? And so forth and so on. Because everything gets mediated through the West. So this is another reason why this is really, I think, extraordinarily important and interesting. All right? And I think that it is these kinds of considerations which I think we have to keep in mind when we try to think of the implications of the consequences of this long African-American encounter with Gandhi. And I hope that in this presentation, you have also implicitly derived some ideas about how we might think about his years in South Africa and the allegations made about him being a racist with respect to the years that he spent in South Africa. Thank you.